All right, so we've been keeping up with the ongoing conflict over in Israel and Palestine, and it's been getting even worse as time goes on. Just in the last couple of days, we've seen the Israeli Defense Forces attack the Al-Aqsa Mosque where people were peacefully praying multiple times now for multiple nights. It was almost lit on fire. We're talking about the third holiest site in all of Islam. In addition to that, we've also seen widespread human rights abuses and what some organizations are even calling war crimes with the forced displacement of Palestinians from their homes in East Jerusalem. And as all of this is happening, we also saw Israel bomb multiple residential buildings in Gaza. And if you don't know, Gaza is basically just it's about a 5 by 25 mile strip that is referred to as the largest open air prison in the world for good reason, because the people in Gaza can't go anywhere. There's no job opportunities. There's nothing stable for them to form a life out of there. There's millions of people in this area, and Israel just continues to obliterate residential buildings. And as all of this is going on, Joe Biden decided to come out, give us his 2 cents, and as expected from somebody like Joe Biden, a vicious imperialist throughout his entire career, this is what he had to say.
Thoughts on Israel?
Are you concerned about the violence in the Middle East, and can you talk about what conversations you have had with officials there?
My national security staff and defense staff has been in constant contact with their counterparts in the Middle East, not just with the Israelis, but also with everyone from the Egyptians to the Saudis to the Emiratis, et cetera. And I had a conversation with Bibi Netanyahu not too long ago. I'll be putting out a statement very shortly on that. My expectation and hope is that this will be closing down sooner than later. But Israel has a right to defend itself when you have thousands of rockets flying into your territory. But I had a conversation for a while with the Prime Minister of Israel, and I think that my hope is that we'll see this coming to conclusion sooner than later. Thank you.
That's it. That's all he has to say. Okay, given the entire context that we just talked about, okay, Israel openly, brazenly admitting war crimes beforehand, even with the exploding and obliterating of residential buildings. And this is what he has to say about it. Just purely a one-sided defense here on behalf of Israel. Nothing to say about the Palestinian people. It's as if they don't even exist in Joe Biden's mind. He did not even mention Palestinians in that entire statement that he just gave on that. Just purely that Israel has a right to defend themselves, and doesn't say the same for Palestinians, which, again, if you understand the context and the situation of what's happening right now, Israel has backed Palestinians into a corner. What exactly do you want them to do? So they can't defend themselves, apparently, according to Joe Biden. Only Israel has a right to defend themselves, even though they are the aggressor in this entire situation. And you have Palestinians who are living in an open-air prison in Gaza, and they can't go anywhere, they can't leave, they can't do anything in their where they live, and meanwhile they're under constant siege from Israel. So what exactly do you want them to do? So they can't fight back with violence. You can't do things like boycott, divestment, sanction, because apparently that's anti-Semitic. So you can't resist peacefully, you can't resist violently. Palestinians are just supposed to sit back and accept this. A full-scale ethnic cleansing. And Joe Biden not only is denying the existence of that ethnic cleansing by not talking about it, but he's actively aiding and abetting it. He is encouraging Israel to continue escalation. That's what he's doing in this clip. He's saying, not only am I not going to call you out for murdering 9 children, as Israel did in the last couple of days, not only am I not even going to mention that or acknowledge that it happened, but I'm going to say, yes, you have a right to defend yourself. Defend yourself, even though we're talking about a nuclear-armed power backed by the largest military in the history of humanity, and they're up against a group of people that has no army, no military, no air force, and they're comparing this as if it's an even war. It's not an even war. It's not even a war. This is a slaughter. It's a one-sided slaughter. And he doesn't even acknowledge one side of it. So it's completely disgusting, unacceptable statement here. Here's what AOC had to say about it. Blanket statements like this with little context or acknowledgement of what precipitated this cycle of violence, namely the expulsion of Palestinians and attacks at Al-Aqsa, dehumanize Palestinians and imply the U.S. will look the other way at human rights violations. It's wrong. Well, yes, if you know anything about U.S. foreign policy and our history, of course we're going to look the other way at human rights violations. It's the same goddamn shit that we're doing right now in Yemen as Saudi Arabia continues the blockade. They continue a genocide against the Yemen people. And Joe Biden has nothing to say about that either. So, yeah, of course Joe Biden is willing to overlook widespread human rights abuses, even war crimes. Because guess what? Joe Biden himself is a war criminal as well. He's a vicious imperialist. He has been his entire life. And so these types of statements from him should be expected. They should still be condemned, but they should also be expected. Of course, this is something that Joe Biden would say. She continues on, by only stepping in to name Hamas's actions, which are condemnable, and refusing to acknowledge the rights of Palestinians, Biden reinforces the false idea that Palestinians instigated this cycle of violence. This is not neutral language. It takes the side of occupation. She's absolutely 100% right. Nobody likes violence coming from any side, whether it's from Hamas, whether it's from Israel. Nobody likes or supports violence. But one side is clearly the aggressor here. You have an occupier and the people being occupied. Okay? You have an oppressor and the people being oppressed. And these conflicts, whenever they occur, and they're, referred to as clashes or wars, if you actually go and look at the civilian casualties and how many people die on the Palestinian side versus how many people die on the Israeli side, it's not even comparable. It's a slaughter. That's the only way that I can think of to characterize this in an accurate way. Continuing on, Joe Biden, in addition to this, apparently, the Biden administration has stonewalled efforts in the UN Security Council to call for a halt to the escalating Israeli-Palestinian violence, leaving the U.S. politically isolated just as it seeks to refurbish its multilateral credentials. So not only is he denying an ethnic cleansing as it's ongoing, but he's actively supporting it. He's blocking efforts at the UN to try to get some sort of control. And don't get me wrong, the UN is not a perfect actor in this situation either. They have enabled and emboldened Israel for years. But even the moderate steps that they are trying to take, Joe Biden is stonewalling that. And why? Because he doesn't really give a shit what happens to the Palestinian people. He just doesn't. He doesn't. He's done this throughout his entire career. He's been one of the most vehement and open supporters of Israel no matter what. I was just watching clips earlier today of years ago when he was in the Senate. And he basically just made widespread excuses for the killing of innocent civilians. And he compared it to the United States invasion of Afghanistan. And he said, well, remember when we accidentally bombed a wedding in Afghanistan and killed a bunch of civilians? Well, that was just part of the greater project. Of course we had to do it. And yeah, in a similar way, of course, Israel has to sometimes slaughter innocent civilians in order to act on their own security interests. This is the mindset that Joe Biden has on these issues. Again, because he's a vicious imperialist and has been throughout his entire life. But, this type of shit is just completely unacceptable. And it's coming at a time as we're seeing escalation from Israel. So this isn't confirmed 100% that this is going to happen, a ground invasion. But this is the latest from what we've seen. Israeli Defense Minister threatens Gaza will burn as IDF readies plans for ground invasion. Israeli Defense Minister Benny Gantz threatened that Gaza will burn as Israel's military reportedly readied plans Thursday for a possible ground invasion of the occupied Palestinian territory, a major escalation that human rights advocates warned would lead to more destruction and civilian deaths. In remarks dubbed as a message to the people of Gaza, Gantz, who served as the chief of general staff for the IDF during Israel's deadly 2014 invasion of the Gaza Strip, which, by the way, over 500 Palestinian children were killed, claimed that, quote, Hamas leaders bear responsibility for your being hunkered down in your homes amid Israeli airstrikes. If the citizens of Israel have to sleep in shelters due to Hamas rocket attacks, Gantz said late Wednesday, then Gaza will burn. Let's not mince words here. This is an open admission that they are planning war crimes. That's what this is. Because again, Hamas can launch rockets at Israel, right? Israel has this thing called the Iron Dome, and in large part, it intercepts a lot of those rockets. A lot of the rockets also just land in open fields because Hamas is not a serious military, okay? They don't have the access to the military-grade equipment and weapons that Israel does. This is not an even fight. So yes, Hamas can launch a bunch of rockets where 99.9% of them get intercepted or fall into an empty field, and some of them may hit, and I'm not praising the rocket attacks from Hamas. But what I'm saying is, this is not an even fight. So when Israel comes in, and they pretend as if we're going to start this war, and we're going to invade Gaza potentially, and we're going to, go and fight for the Israeli defense, this is not an offense, okay? This is not a defense. It's a full-scale assault that they're planning here. If this happens, if there is a full-scale invasion of Gaza, this will be a slaughter of primarily innocent civilians. That is a guarantee. If you go and look at what happened in 2014, it was a lot of civilians that were being killed. Okay, it was a majority of civilians that were being killed. And so that's exactly what will happen if this happens as they're describing it here. So again, we don't know 100% if they're planning a full-scale invasion of Gaza, but if this type of shit happens, and if this escalation continues, and if Israel continues to brazenly commit war crimes, Joe Biden, his administration, and the rest of the politicians who are giving blanket defense for Israel while completely ignoring the plight of the Palestinians as if they don't exist, they will have blood on their hands 100%. They will be culpable in this 100%. So let's keep acknowledging what's actually happening on the ground here and acknowledge the situation as it is. This is a violent settler colonial force that is putting its boot down on the Palestinian people, and Joe Biden is helping them do it.